You can spend years studying something and still be unable to explain what it means. That is the strange scandal hiding beneath modern education. Students pass exams, collect notes, repeat definitions, and walk away with the comforting feeling that they know. But the moment a real question appears, simple, direct, almost innocent, that confidence collapses, not because they are lazy, not because they are stupid, because they were trained to remember without being taught to understand. That is the moment learning breaks. It breaks when knowledge becomes performance instead of perception. It breaks when the goal shifts from seeing clearly to sounding correct. And most people never notice it happening, because memorization is one of the most convincing disguises ignorance has ever worn. It feels productive, it feels disciplined, it even feels intelligent. You can fill notebooks, highlight pages, recite frameworks, and still be building nothing inside your mind except a fragile tower of borrowed words. Maybe you have felt this yourself. You read a chapter, and it seems familiar. You watch an explanation, and it sounds clear. You review your notes, and everything looks organized. But when you try to explain the idea alone, without the textbook open, without the teacher's phrasing, without the safety of recognition, your mind hesitates. The structure is missing. The logic is missing. What felt like knowledge turns out to be memory wearing the mask of understanding. That experience is more common than most people admit. In fact, many people build their entire academic life on that illusion. They learn how to survive the system by storing answers instead of constructing insight. They become skilled at repeating language they have never made their own. And because the system rewards correct output more than deep comprehension, the illusion keeps getting stronger. Good grades can hide weak thinking. Fluent language can hide mental emptiness. Even confidence can hide confusion. This is why so many hardworking people secretly feel inadequate. They are doing everything they were told to do, yet something still feels hollow. They can pass, but they cannot explain. They can recall, but they cannot rebuild. They can recognize the answer, but they cannot arrive at it honestly. The problem is not a lack of effort. The problem is that effort aimed at memorization creates dependency, not mastery. Richard Feynman saw this with unusual clarity. He understood that the real test of learning was never whether you could repeat the right words. It was whether you could take an idea apart, hold it in your own mind, and make it simple without making it false. That is a completely different standard. And once you see that difference, ordinary studying starts to look less like education and more like rehearsal. The question is no longer how much you can remember. The question is whether you truly understand anything at all. And that is where this changes. Because the habit that makes people feel educated is often the habit preventing understanding. Before you can think, you have to stop mistaking stored information for insight. You have to see the break before you can repair it. Once you see that break, another problem becomes impossible to ignore. False understanding does not feel false. It feels almost identical to the real thing. That is why memorization is so dangerous. It does not arrive looking weak. It arrives dressed as competence. It gives you quick answers, familiar phrases, and the reassuring comfort of recognition. And because recognition is easier than reasoning, the mind accepts the imitation before it has earned the original. That is the real trap. Most people do not confuse memorization with understanding because they are careless. They confuse them because the surface signals look the same. A student repeats a formula smoothly, so everyone assumes the idea is clear. A professional uses the right terminology, so others assume the thinking is deep. An expert speaks with polished confidence, so the audience assumes the structure underneath is solid. But language can be borrowed. Clarity cannot. Performance can be practiced. Understanding has to be built. This is why so many intelligent people remain dependent on notes, guides, examples, and authority. They have learned to recognize patterns, not generate them. They can follow the path once it is shown, but they struggle to recreate it from first principles. They know the map only when someone else is holding it. The moment that support disappears, the illusion weakens. What looked like mastery becomes hesitation. What looked like knowledge becomes recall with no engine inside it. Think about how often modern learning rewards this. Students cram facts they will forget after the exam. Workers memorize procedures without understanding the logic behind them. People consume books, podcasts, lectures, and tutorials at high speed, mistaking exposure for transformation. Information enters, but very little changes shape inside the mind. The person feels informed, yet remains fragile. The slightest unexpected question exposes the gap between possession and comprehension. That gap gap matters more than most people realize. When you only memorize, your knowledge is rigid. It works in the exact form you stored it, but fails the moment reality bends. You can answer the question you expected, but not the one you did not rehearse. You can repeat the explanation you heard, but not translate it into your own language. You can imitate intelligence, but you cannot use it freely. And in real life, freedom is the proof. Real understanding moves, it adapts, it survives pressure. Memorized knowledge breaks the moment the script changes. This is also why genuine learning often feels worse in the beginning. Memorization gives you speed. Understanding demands struggle. Memorization gives you the pleasure of quick familiarity. Understanding forces you into confusion, contradiction, and mental discomfort. One flatters the ego early, the other builds strength slowly. That is why shallow learners often look impressive at first, while deep thinkers appear slower, less polished, even uncertain. But the difference reveals itself over time. The fast answer fades. The deeply understood idea stays. So the danger is not simply that memorization is limited. The deeper danger is that it makes you feel finished when you have barely begun. It creates the illusion of arrival before the journey has started, and once a person mistakes recognition for mastery, growth slows down. They stop asking better questions because they think they already possess the answer. They stop testing their understanding because familiarity has already convinced them. They stop building real competence because the appearance of competence feels good enough. That is the illusion Feynman refused to live inside. He understood that knowing the words was easy. Knowing what the words meant was rare. And the distance between those two things is exactly where most learners get lost. What made Feynman different was not that he knew more facts than everyone else. It was that he did not trust facts until they became clear inside his own mind. He was not chasing the appearance of intelligence. He was chasing contact with reality. And that meant he treated knowledge less like something to collect and more like something to test, strip down, rebuild, and earn. Most people approach learning like storage. They gather definitions, examples, and explanations, then stack them in memory and hope the structure will hold when needed. Feynman approached learning like reconstruction. He wanted to know whether an idea could survive outside the textbook, outside expert language, outside the polished form in which it was first delivered. If it could not survive that translation, then in his eyes it had not yet been understood. This is where his method becomes so powerful and so uncomfortable. Feynman would take an idea and try to explain it in plain language, as if speaking to someone intelligent but unfamiliar with the topic. Not simpler words for the sake of sounding friendly, simpler words for the sake of honesty, because complexity can hide confusion, but simplicity exposes it. The moment you try to say something clearly, without jargon, your weak points reveal themselves. You discover whether you truly see the logic or whether you have only memorized the surface. That is why this method is not a trick. It is an act of intellectual self-respect. It forces you to stop hiding behind the language of other people. If you cannot explain an idea simply, you are not being punished. You are being shown exactly where your understanding ends. That moment can feel embarrassing, but it is actually the beginning of real learning. Confusion, when faced directly, becomes a map. It tells you where to return, what to question, and what still needs to be rebuilt. Feynman also did something most learners avoid. He went back to first principles. Instead of leaning forever on finished conclusions, he tried to reconnect ideas to their basic logic. He wanted to know where something came from, what assumptions it depended on, and why it had to be true, rather than merely accepted as true. This changed everything, because when you understand a thing from the ground up, you no longer carry it as a dead fact. You carry it as a living structure, and living structures can be used, adapted, and trusted. That is the deeper difference between remembering and understanding. Remembering gives you an answer. Understanding gives you the ability to regenerate the answer. Remembering is static. Understanding is active. One depends on the original source staying nearby. The other makes you independent of it. This is why Feynman's approach creates power that lasts. It does not decorate the mind with information. It trains the mind to think. He was also brutally honest about gaps. Most people protect their ego by avoiding the places where their knowledge feels thin. Feynman did the opposite. He treated gaps as valuable signals. If something was unclear, that was not a reason to move on quickly. It was a reason to stop, press harder, and refuse the comfort of premature certainty. He understood that false clarity is more dangerous than confusion, because confusion can be corrected, while false clarity becomes a prison. This is why his way of learning feels slower at first and stronger later. It asks more of you in the beginning. It demands patience, humility, and the willingness to look foolish while your thinking is still taking shape. But in return, it gives you something memorization never can, a mind that can stand on its own, a mind that can explain, adapt, derive, and question, a mind that is no longer trapped inside borrowed language. And that is what makes the Feynman standard so demanding. It is not about sounding smart, it is about becoming impossible to fool with your own rehearsed knowledge. It asks you to trade quick certainty for durable understanding, borrowed phrasing for mental ownership, and passive familiarity for real command. Once you accept that standard, learning stops being a performance and becomes a discipline of truth. Once you start learning this way, something deeper begins to change. At first, it seems like a method for studying better, but over time, it becomes a method for thinking differently. You stop treating knowledge as something to collect and start treating it as something to build. That shift sounds small, yet it changes the entire relationship between your mind and the world. Information is no longer something you stack on top of yourself like decoration. It becomes raw material for a more disciplined, independent, and durable kind of intelligence. This is the transformation most people never experience, because memorization rewards accumulation, while understanding demands reconstruction. One makes you feel full, the other makes you feel unfinished. One lets you gather facts quickly and display them on command. The other forces you to slow down, take ideas apart, and rebuild them until they become your own. That is why real learning often feels less glamorous than shallow learning. It is quieter, slower, and harder to show off, but it creates a completely different person. When you truly understand something, your confidence changes shape. It is no longer the brittle confidence of having seen the answer before. It becomes the calmer confidence of knowing you can find your way back to the answer, even if the surface details disappear. That kind of confidence matters because life rarely gives you the exact problem you rehearsed. Real situations are messy. They shift. They combine pieces you studied separately. Memorized knowledge struggles in those moments because it depends on familiarity. Understanding survives because it depends on structure. That is why the Feynman approach is so powerful for anyone who wants more than academic success. It trains flexibility. It teaches you to move from examples to principles, from principles to applications, and from applications back to explanation. Instead of becoming someone who can only repeat what was taught, you become someone who can think with what was learned. That is a radical difference. One learner carries information like cargo. The other turns information into capability, and capability is the real goal, even if most systems pretend otherwise. The point of learning is not to look informed, it is to become able to explain, able to adapt, able to solve, able to question, able to see through confusion instead of being controlled by it. Once you understand this, struggle stops looking like failure. It starts looking like evidence that real construction is happening. Confusion is no longer an insult to your intelligence. It is a normal stage in building it. This is why simplification matters so much. When you force yourself to explain an idea in plain language, you are not reducing its depth. You are testing whether the depth is real. If the idea collapses without technical language, then the understanding was borrowed. If it survives in simple words, then it has entered your own mind. Simplicity is not the opposite of intelligence. It is one of its highest proofs. The same is true of mental discomfort. Most people run from it. The moment an idea becomes difficult, they reach for a summary, an answer key, or someone else's polished explanation. But discomfort is where transformation begins. It is the signal that your old mental structure is too weak for what you are trying to hold. If you stay there long enough, questioning, reducing, rebuilding, trying again, the structure changes. Your mind becomes more precise, more resilient, less dependent on external support. You begin noticing patterns faster, asking better questions, and trusting your reasoning more than borrowed certainty under pressure. That is the hidden reward of deep understanding. It does not just give you better answers, it gives you a better self. A self that is less easily impressed by jargon, less easily fooled by confidence, less hungry for shortcuts, and more committed to truth. You stop measuring learning by how much you can store and start measuring it by how much you can do with what you know. That is the movement from information to transformation, and once that movement begins, the old way of learning starts to feel unbearably small. In the end, everything comes down to a test that no amount of performance can hide from. Not the test in a classroom, not the test that rewards speed, memory, or polished phrasing. the test of whether the knowledge you claim to have can actually live inside you without support. Can you explain it clearly? Can you use it when the situation changes? Can you rebuild it when the script disappears? If the answer is no, then whatever comfort you felt was borrowed certainty. That is the standard most people avoid because it removes every easy hiding place. Memorization can survive inside repetition. Understanding has to survive inside pressure. Memorization works when the question arrives exactly as expected. Understanding works when reality refuses to cooperate. One depends on familiarity. The other depends on structure. One lets you look prepared. The other makes you prepared, and you know which one your life will demand from you. This is why Feynman's way feels less like a study technique and more like a moral challenge. It asks whether you want the appearance of intelligence or the substance of it. It asks whether you want to sound informed or become capable. Those are not the same ambition. One is social, the other is internal. One wins approval early, the other earns freedom later. And most people choose the first because it is faster, safer, and easier to display. But there is a cost to that choice. When your knowledge is only memorized, you remain fragile. You become dependent on notes, authority, formulas, familiar examples, and the wording you first encountered. You can move only where the path has been marked. The moment the world asks for adaptation, judgment, or original explanation, your confidence begins to shake. That is not because you are incapable. It is because you stopped at recognition and called it mastery. Real mastery is quieter and less theatrical. It does not always look impressive in the beginning because it is built through private struggle. It grows when you admit you do not understand, return to the basics, translate complexity into simple language, and test your thinking without the safety of borrowed phrasing. No one applauds those moments, but they are where intellectual independence is formed. So the real question is not whether you can remember more. The real question is whether you are willing to demand more from yourself, whether you are willing to stop using familiarity as proof, whether you are willing to sit with the discomfort of not yet understanding instead of escaping into rehearsed answers, whether you are willing to trade quick correctness for durable clarity. That trade feels expensive in the short term. In the long term, it is the price of becoming capable, adaptable, and hard to fool. From this point on, every idea you learn can become a mirror. When you meet a concept, do not ask, "Can I repeat this?" Ask, "Can I explain it simply? Can I connect it to first principles? Can I apply it somewhere new? Can I rebuild it if the original wording vanishes?" Those questions expose the difference between decorated memory and real command. They are uncomfortable questions. That is why they matter, because once you start living by that standard, learning stops being a ritual of accumulation and becomes a discipline of truth. You stop chasing the feeling of being knowledgeable and start building the reality of being capable. You stop asking how to store more and start asking how to see clearly. The world is full of people who can repeat. It is far rarer to find someone who truly understands. The next time you feel certain that you know something, pause and test it. Not to punish yourself, but to free yourself. That is Feynman's real challenge. And once you accept it, memorizing everything will never feel like enough again.